The studio blazed under rows of hot white lights, each one a miniature sun burning overhead. They poured down in relentless beams, bleaching shadows from every corner. The polished floor reflected them back so bright it almost hurt to look. Cameras lined the perimeter like sentinels, their red tally lights blinking in unison, recording every twitch, every flicker of expression. The click and whir of their lenses became a rhythm of its own, syncing with the faint hum of the power cables snaking across the floor. Microphones hung like quiet predators from the rafters, waiting to catch every word. In the audience, seats were filled shoulder to shoulder, strangers pressed close, whispering in low tones. 100 small conversations layered into one restless murmur, as if the whole room shared the same unspoken question. When will it begin? A faint smell of coffee and metal drifted through the air, part caffeine, part cold machinery. Stage hands moved with quick, careful steps, adjusting cables, straightening chairs, smoothing the edge of the backdrop. Producers in black headsets weaved through the aisles, voices sharp and clipped as they issued last-second instructions. The air was thick, charged with the same kind of pressure that builds before a summer storm. Even the audience who came for spectacle felt it, the weight of something about to break. Every eye was fixed on the center of the stage, waiting for the first voice to cut through the silence and shatter the tension. From the far side of the stage, Jasmine Crockett emerged. Her steps were steady, deliberate heels, striking the polished floor with a measured rhythm that seemed to echo in the charged air. The dark fabric of her suit caught the studio light's sharp lines, framing a posture that spoke of control. She didn't glance at the audience, not once. Her eyes were locked forward, already fixed on the man across from her. Donald Trump sat at the opposite desk, shoulders back, chin slightly raised in a practiced display of authority. His suit, a deep navy, was immaculate. The red tie fell perfectly straight, as if it had been adjusted moments before. He leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone used to owning the room, but there was a faint tension in the set of his jaw. Their eyes met, no handshake, no nod, just a collision of two gazes, each measuring the other. The air between them seemed to tighten, as if the stage itself understood the weight of what was coming. The crowd went still instinctively, sensing that the real battle had begun before a single word was spoken. Beneath the polished oak of the desk, Jasmine's right hand rested lightly on her lap. Her fingertips brushed the edge of a slim leather purse, ordinary at first glance, but inside it lay something far from ordinary. A small USB drive no bigger than a thumb waited there. Its black casing was worn smooth with age, the label faded but still legible in sharp, unmistakable handwriting. Tiffany, 2004. Dinner. 19 years of silence had been compressed into those few grams of plastic and metal. The memory of what it contained was as sharp as the day she first heard it. Voices over the clink of silverware, a sentence so cold it could freeze the air in the room. She had carried it into the studio not as a prop, not as a threat, but as a promise. Across from her, Trump adjusted his tie with a single practiced tug, unaware of how close that promise was to being fulfilled. The audience didn't know it yet, but the storm had already formed. It was there in her purse, a storm 19 years in the making, waiting for the moment to break. Her hand lingered on the purse for just a second longer, the way a diver lingers on the edge before plunging into deep, dark water. In that tiny drive was a voice, familiar, powerful, captured in a moment he thought no one would ever remember. A voice that could slice through years of public image, a single sentence strong enough to make headlines tremble. She knew what it said. He knew what he'd said. And if the world heard it, everything could shift in an instant. Somewhere in the audience, a camera operator zoomed in on her face, catching the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. A hint that she carried something the rest of the room didn't. What was in that recording? What could one man's words from 19 years ago possibly reveal that might shake the foundation of a presidency and make an entire nation gasp? Trump leaned forward, resting one hand on the edge of the desk, the other gesturing broadly as if to draw the whole room into his orbit. His voice filled the studio, smooth, confident, the kind of cadence honed over decades in front of cameras. You know, he began, when I talk about success, I don't just mean buildings and businesses. I mean family. My children, each of them, are extraordinary. They've all made me proud. They've all achieved things most people can only dream of. A ripple of polite laughter drifted through the audience. Some heads nodded, others smiled faintly, as if they'd heard this speech before and still found it charming. Trump's eyes moved slowly across the crowd, soaking in the approval like it was currency. But across the desk, Jasmine didn't smile. Her posture stayed steady, her gaze fixed on him, not with admiration, but with the quiet precision of someone watching a man set his own stage for what's to come. In her purse, the USB seemed heavier, as if it could feel its moment approaching. Jasmine leaned forward just enough to close the space between her and the microphone. Her hands folded neatly on the desk, but there was nothing casual in the way she moved. I've always believed she began her tone calm, but edged with steel that leadership doesn't start in boardrooms or on campaign stages. It starts at home. How you treat the people closest to you says more about your character than any title you can hold. Her eyes never left Trump, not for a second. The words were spoken to the room, but the weight of them landed squarely in front of him. In the audience, a few faces shifted, small, almost imperceptible changes, as if they'd felt the temperature drop. Trump kept his smile, but his eyes narrowed, the kind of narrowing that says he'd just heard something he couldn't quite ignore. Jasmine sat back slightly, letting the words hang in the air like the faint smell of ozone before a lightning strike. From the far corner of the stage, half hidden behind a camera rig, Marcus watched. He'd been Jasmine's aide for years, long enough to recognize the precise rhythm of her moves, the way she built a moment piece by piece. When she delivered that last line, "Leadership begins at home," Marcus' shoulders shifted ever so slightly. To anyone else, it was nothing. To Jasmine, it was a signal. He raised his hand to adjust his earpiece, then tapped his index finger twice against the side of his temple, quick, subtle, invisible to the audience. The gesture meant one thing: it's time. Jasmine didn't move, didn't nod, but a flicker passed through her eyes, just enough for Marcus to know she'd received it. The USB in her purse seemed to grow heavier by the second, like it was pulling her toward the inevitable. Trump kept talking, unaware that the invisible clock between them had just skipped ahead. Somewhere in the undercurrent of the room, the countdown had begun. The audience didn't know the details, couldn't possibly guess the weight of what was sitting just feet away in Jasmine's purse, but they felt it. It was there in the way conversations faltered mid-sentence, in the way people leaned forward without realizing it. The air seemed heavier now, pressing against skin and clothing, humming in a way that was almost audible. A few audience members shifted in their seats, glancing at one another with small, questioning looks. No one could explain it, but everyone could sense it, like static building before a lightning strike. Trump's voice kept filling the room, but the edges of his words seemed sharper, carrying a tension they hadn't moments ago. Jasmine's stillness, her unblinking focus, only fed the feeling that something unseen was about to move. In the control booth, a producer's hand hovered over the camera switch, her eyes darting between feeds, as if trying to guess where the moment would break. It hadn't happened yet, but every person in the room felt the same silent truth. Something was coming. Jasmine shifted in her seat just enough to draw the eyes of the cameras. Her voice was calm, measured, but carried a sharp undercurrent, the kind that cuts through every other sound in the room. "Let's hear it in your own words." For a fraction of a second, the room didn't move. Trump's smile stiffened, his chin tilting just slightly, as if he wasn't sure what he just heard. The audience went silent, the kind of silence that feels like the air itself has stopped moving. Jasmine's right hand slid toward her purse fingers, brushing the zipper before pausing. She turned her head slowly toward the control booth, locking eyes with Marcus in the far corner. One subtle nod. Marcus' hand moved to the console, pressing the button that would pour 19 years of buried truth into the open. The first faint click of the audio file loaded, and in that instant, every person in the studio knew whatever came next. They wouldn't be able to unhear it. A faint hiss of static filled the studio, the kind of sound that makes everyone instinctively lean closer. Then through the speakers, a voice emerged, deep, unmistakable, and colder than anyone expected. Trump's voice, recorded 19 years earlier. "She's not really part of the family." The words landed like a hammer on glass, sharp, final, impossible to take back. Gasps rippled through the audience, a low collective intake of breath that broke the stillness. Someone in the back muttered, "Oh my God," barely loud enough to hear. Trump sat frozen, his expression tight, as if he could stop the recording by sheer force of will. Jasmine didn't move, didn't smile. She just let the words hang there, heavy and undeniable. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of judgment, of realization, of a truth that had been hidden for nearly 2 decades now, laid bare for everyone to hear. For a long second, no one moved. The words still seemed to echo, bouncing off the studio walls long after the recording had gone silent. In the front row, a woman covered her mouth with both hands. From somewhere in the middle section came a sharp whisper, "Oh my God," followed by another, and then another, until the phrase became a scattered chorus. Camera operators exchanged quick, wide-eyed glances, but kept their lenses steady, knowing this was the shot every network would want. In the control booth, a producer mouthed something that never made it to the comms, too stunned to form full words. Trump sat rigid, his jaw tight, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed the hit. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. She let the silence do the work, stretching it until the tension became almost unbearable. It was the kind of moment that would replay on loop across every news broadcast, every social feed, the exact second the air went out of the room and the story took on a life of its own. Trump leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk, like it might steady the ground beneath him. His voice came out fast, sharp, almost tripping over itself. "That's fake, completely fake. Probably one of those deep fake things you people make." "I've never said that ever." He gestured toward the control booth, palm up, demanding the audio be shut off. But the edge in his tone wasn't matched by his eyes. They darted once to the audience, once to Jasmine, then back to the cameras, never staying still long enough to anchor. A thin sheen of sweat caught the light on his temple. The confident grin from earlier was gone, replaced by something tighter, more brittle. In the front row, a man folded his arms, staring at Trump with the unblinking focus of someone weighing truth against performance. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let him speak every denial, only making the tension thicker. Somewhere in the audience, a woman whispered, "If it's fake, why does he look like that?" The question hung in the air like smoke. From the shadowed hallway behind the stage, a figure emerged. Not rushed, not hesitant. Each step was deliberate, the kind of measured pace that draws attention without a single word. He wore a crisp white shirt under a black vest, the uniform of a high-end waiter. But his presence carried something more in authority that didn't match the role. In his right hand, he clutched a small leather-bound notebook, its corners worn pages thick with time. The audience shifted, a low murmur rolling through the rows. Cameras swung toward him instinctively, sensing that his entrance meant something big. Jasmine's eyes followed his every move, her expression unreadable but undeniably focused. Trump's head turned slowly, and for the first time that night, there was a flash of something unmistakable in his eyes' recognition. The waiter stopped just short of the desk, the air around him thick with unspoken history. He didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. His very presence said, "Enough, I was there." The waiter stepped closer, his voice low but steady, carrying the weight of memory. It was a private dinner. 19 years ago in the Gold Room at the St. Regis. Tiffany, she couldn't have been more than 11, was sitting near the end of the long table. When he walked in, her whole face lit up. She straightened in her chair, smoothed her dress. You could see she was just waiting for him to notice her. He paused, his eyes locked on the Trump, but he didn't. He went around the table, greeting everyone else, shaking hands, slapping backs. When he reached her seat, he just passed by, didn't touch her shoulder, didn't say her name. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Jasmine didn't move, letting the words sink in. She kept smiling for a while, the waiter added, his voice softening, but I was close enough to see her eyes. They stopped shining long before dessert. The waiter's gaze didn't break from Trump. His voice lowered, each word deliberate, as if placing stones into the silence. And then he said, as he passed her seat, I heard him say. He drew in a slow breath. "She's not really part of the family." The phrase was identical to the one the audience had just heard in the recording. Same cadence, same cold finality. It landed a second time like a fresh blow, sharper now because it came from someone who had been there, someone who had no microphone, no cameras, no reason to lie. The room froze. Even the faint whir of the cameras seemed to fade. Every face turned toward Trump, waiting. But Trump didn't speak. Not yet. The only sound was the slow, measured breathing of 100 people who suddenly understood the weight of what they just heard twice. Trump's chair screeched against the floor as he leaned forward, palms slamming flat on the desk. His voice came out louder than the room expected, sharp, booming with an edge that made the microphones crackle. "This is a lie, a disgusting lie. This man is making it up." He pointed a rigid finger at the waiter, jabbing the air like it could pierce through him. "If you're so sure, then take a polygraph. Right here, right now. Let's see you tell your little story hooked up to a machine." Gas flickered through the audience. The waiter didn't flinch, he just held Trump's gaze unblinking. Jasmine sat perfectly still, her hands folded, letting the scene play out. She knew the louder the denial, the more the cracks began to show. Trump's chest rose and fell faster now, a flush creeping up the sides of his neck. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out, "Why so scared then?" It wasn't loud, but it carried, and it stuck. The sharp, deliberate click, click, click of high heels echoed from the wings. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady enough to slice through the low hum of whispers in the room. Every head turned toward the source. Even Trump's gaze broke away from the waiter, his eyes narrowing. From behind the heavy black curtain, a silhouette appeared, slender, upright, carrying an unmistakable confidence in every step. The stage lights caught just enough to reveal the glint of metal at her wrist, the sway of a tailored jacket. The sound grew louder, each step measured until the entire studio seemed to fall into rhythm with it. For a moment it felt less like someone was entering a hearing and more like a queen stepping into her court. Jasmine's lips pressed into the faintest smile. She knew exactly who it was, and judging by the way Trump's jaw tightened, so did he. The figure stepped fully into the light, and the collective murmur of the audience broke into a wave of startled whispers. Tiffany Trump. Her posture was poised, shoulders square, chin lifted just enough to show composure. But her eyes told the real story. They were steady, fixed ahead, yet shadowed by something deeper, a hurt that had been carried quietly for far too long. The lights caught the soft gleam of tears that hadn't yet fallen. Her lips pressed together, holding back words she wasn't ready to say, at least not yet. Trump's expression faltered for the briefest moment, the mask slipping before he forced it back on. In that tiny crack, the cameras caught everything. Tiffany walked toward the desk, her heels still tapping that steady rhythm, each step measured like she was crossing not just a stage, but 19 years of silence. When she reached Jasmine's side, she didn't sit. She just stood there facing her father. The calm on her face didn't soften the weight in her gaze, it only sharpened it. Tiffany drew in a slow breath, her chest rising and falling as if she were gathering every ounce of courage she had left. When she spoke, her voice was warm, soft enough to carry care, but underneath there was a faint tremor that betrayed the storm inside. "I've been silent too long." The words seemed to hang in the air, refusing to rush. Every syllable was deliberate, as though she needed each one to land in the exact place it was meant to. Trump's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin, unreadable line. But his fingers curled on the desk, tapped once against the wood, a restless tell that the cameras didn't miss. Jasmine shifted slightly enough to glance at Tiffany, without turning her head, a silent nod urging her forward. The audience didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly. They knew instinctively that this was the moment the dam was about to break. Tiffany's voice steadied, losing the tremor, but not the weight. She locked eyes with her father, her words slow, deliberate, meant to land like stones in still water. "You chose image over me." The sentence was short, but it hit harder than any long speech could. It didn't accuse with rage, it simply stated a truth, and that truth was heavy enough to make the audience's chest tighten. A woman in the second row pressed a tissue to her mouth. Someone else shook their head, slowly, their eyes glistening. Trump didn't move, but the faint muscle in his jaw twitched. For a moment it looked like he might speak, but the words never came. Jasmine's gaze flickered between them, sensing the silent war being fought in front of the entire nation. The pause stretched heavy and unbroken. In living rooms across America, people would replay this one line again and again, because sometimes the simplest truths are the most devastating. The question came from somewhere off camera, a reporter's voice cutting through the thick air. "Do you have anything you want to say to your daughter?" Trump didn't look at the reporter. He didn't look at Tiffany either. His eyes stayed fixed on a point just past the cameras, as if staring hard enough into the distance could make the moment disappear. Seconds ticked by, 1, 2, 3. The silence grew heavier, with each one pressing down on everyone in the room. Tiffany didn't move, didn't blink. She just stood there, her gaze locked on him, waiting for something. A word, a gesture, anything. But nothing came. Somewhere in the audience, a chair creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. The absence of an answer was louder than any speech he could have given. It was the kind of silence that would be replayed and dissected for years, a silence that felt like confirmation. The silence finally cracked, not from Trump, but from the seats. A small cluster in the back began to clap. Slow at first, then a little louder, like they were trying to will others to join them. The sound was warm, supportive, but it didn't fill the room. From the left side of the audience came low, sharp whispers. A woman shook her head and muttered, "Unbelievable." A man beside her leaned forward, hissing something about political theater under his breath. The two sounds, applause and disapproval, collided in the air, neither strong enough to drown out the other. It made the room feel fractured, unstable. Jasmine's eyes swept the crowd, reading the temperature like a general before battle. Tiffany didn't react to either side. Her face stayed still, but the faint tightening of her jaw showed she'd heard every sound. Trump remained motionless, the applause never reaching him, the whispers never touching him, at least not on the surface. Jasmine rose from her seat, her voice cutting clean through the noise of applause and murmurs. She didn't need to shout. Her tone carried the kind of authority that made people listen. "If you can't value your own blood, how can you value a nation?" The words landed like a gavel strike, sharp, final, undeniable. A hush fell instantly, as if the room itself had been called to order. Trump's eyes flicked toward her, a flash of something unreadable crossing his face before it vanished again. Tiffany stood motionless beside Jasmine, the line hanging in the air like a verdict. Even the cameras seemed to hold still, framing the moment, as though they knew it would be replayed endlessly across the country. Somewhere in the back, a single pair of hands began to clap again. This time more joined in. The sound swelled, not wild but resolute, like an acknowledgement of truth too plain to ignore. The air in the room felt thicker now, as if every breath took effort. No one was speaking, but the silence wasn't empty. It was dense, pressing down on every shoulder. The cameras began to move slow and deliberate, their lenses hunting for the smallest crack in composure. One frame caught the tight line of Trump's mouth, a twitch at the corner that looked almost like a wince. Another closed in on Tiffany, her jaw clenched, her eyes shining but unbroken. Jasmine's face filled a third shot, her gaze unwavering, her lips pressed into the faintest knowing smile. In the control room, directors whispered quick commands. "Hold on him now," cut to her, tighter, tighter. They knew they weren't just capturing faces. They were capturing history in real time. Every close-up felt like a magnifying glass held to the truth, and in that truth there was no place to hide. The heavy doors closed behind Tiffany with a muted thud, shutting out the bright lights and the suffocating air of the hearing room. In the dimmer backstage corridor, a different energy awaited her. People, staff, attendees, even strangers were already moving toward her, their faces open and earnest. An older woman reached for her hand, squeezing it with both of hers. "You were brave," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. A young man in a Union jacket stepped forward, next, his eyes wet. "My dad never stood up for me either, but today you stood up for all of us." Others joined in, offering quick words, a pat on the shoulder, a nod that said, "We saw you." Tiffany's breath trembled, but for the first time that day, her lips curved. Not in defiance, not in pain, but in gratitude. Somewhere down the hall, Jasmine approached, quietly placing a hand on her back. No words, just a silent acknowledgement between two women who knew they'd just changed the conversation in the country. Jasmine stood a few paces behind Tiffany, watching the small crowd gather around her. The hum of quiet conversations filled the hallway, but in Jasmine's mind it all faded to stillness. Her gaze lingered on the way strangers reached out, not for spectacle, but for connection. It reminded her of something she'd learned long before stepping into politics. "Family," she murmured to herself, almost too softly for anyone else to hear, "is the one place where truth needs no proof to exist." The words weren't meant for the cameras or the microphones, but a nearby crew member caught them anyway, his eyes flicking up in surprise. She didn't notice. Her eyes were still on Tiffany, who now stood a little taller than when she'd entered the room. Sometimes Jasmine thought the most important battles weren't won in public hearings, but in the quiet, unguarded moments afterward. The screen faded to black, the echoes of the day's confrontation still hanging in the viewer's mind. Then Jasmine's voice, steady, unhurried, cut through the quiet. "In the end, we all face a choice: to keep the kind of silence that feels safe, or to speak a truth that might cost us everything." Her words lingered, not demanding an answer, but refusing to be ignored. A single line appeared on the screen in stark white letters. "What would you choose?" The question stayed there still and unblinking as the faint sound of a heartbeat pulsed in the background. No music, no applause. Just the weight of the choice left entirely to the viewer. If this story moved you, if you believe the truth should never be buried, then be part of keeping it alive. Like this video so it reaches more people. Share it so the conversation doesn't end here. And subscribe so you never miss the stories. The powerful wish would disappear. Your click might seem small, but every voice added makes it harder for the truth to be silenced. This story reminds us that silence can protect comfort, but it will never protect truth. Speaking up, especially to those closest to us, can be risky, painful, even costly. But without courage, injustice survives and lies become history. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in courtrooms or on national TV. They're fought in the living rooms, the dinner tables, and the quiet moments when we decide whether to stay silent or to speak. If you believe that stories like this matter, that the truth deserves to be heard, then join us. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it so that voices like Tiffany's are never lost in the noise. Together we can make sure the stories that need to be told will never be buried.